By the time I reached Normandy, the word arrival had lost its meaning. Nothing felt like a beginning. It felt more like being dropped into something already broken and left to make sense of it. The ground was wet in a way that never seemed to. Dry, heavy underfoot, clinging to boots and tracks alike. The air hung low and gray, pressing down on everything. Farms stood half alive, walls split open, tools abandoned where hands had let go. It was quiet in a way that made you listen too hard, as if the land itself was waiting to see what kind of men had come to finish ruining it. Remember seeing the Sherman properly for the first time there, not on paper, not in training, but sitting. In it, touching the steel, feeling how thin it was between me and whatever waited ahead. Inside, everything was close, crowded, too warm even in the cool air. You learned quickly where your body fit and where it didn't, because there was no room for hesitation. I had heard the jokes already, the things the Germans were said to. Think about our tanks. At the time, it didn't make me angry. It made me uneasy. Mockery meant they had confidence, and confidence usually came from experience. Saint Lay was spoken about constantly, but never clearly. It was always ahead of us, just beyond the next stretch of hedgerow, the next bend in the road. The countryside forced you to move carefully. The tall hedges cut the land into tight compartments, each one a question you had to answer before moving on. You couldn't see far, couldn't plan much. Every field felt like a trap designed by someone who knew exactly how armor liked to move and how easily it could be stopped. That uncertainty settled into the body. You carried it in your shoulders, in the way you breathed. At night, when we halted, exhaustion didn't bring comfort. It only dulled the edges. I would lie there thinking about how small everything suddenly felt, how narrow the world had become. Not brave thoughts, not heroic ones. Just the steady realization that whatever was coming would not care how ready we felt. I was young then, but that was the first time I understood how quickly war ages a man. Not through action, but through waiting, through knowing that soon the land ahead would demand something from you that you might not be able to give back. Waiting was harder than moving. Once we were in position, tucked in behind hedgerows and broken earth, time began to stretch in strange ways. Minutes felt heavy, packed tight with thoughts no one wanted. You checked the same things again and again, hands going through motions they already knew, just to keep them from shaking. The tank sat low and still, engine quiet, metal cooling around us. In that silence, every small sound felt too loud. Every distant movement seemed closer than it was. You didn't talk much. There was nothing useful to say, and anything else felt like tempting fate. The hedgerows boxed us in on all sides. They were thick, old, grown wild over generations, not something you could simply push through without exposing yourself. Roads twisted narrowly between them, forcing armor into predictable paths. We knew the Germans understood that better than anyone. They had fought here long enough to learn the land's habits. I remember thinking how easily we could be watched, without ever seeing who was watching us. That kind of knowledge sat in the back of the mind, never loud, but never leaving either. There was a feeling among us that we were being measured, not just by the enemy, but by the ground itself. Our tank felt small there, almost fragile, and we all knew what the other side preferred to fight with. The idea of meeting heavier German armor in those tight lanes didn't inspire confidence. Still, no one complained. Complaints didn't change steel thickness or sight lines. They only made the waiting longer. So we stayed quiet, eyes forward, listening for something that would finally force time to move again. I remember glancing at the men around me, studying their faces in that half-light. Everyone looked older than they should have. Not from wounds or dirt, but from concentration, from carrying fear without letting it show. That was the moment when doubt settled in fully. Not doubt about orders, but about luck. About whether this narrow patch of Norman countryside would decide something permanent for us before we ever had a chance to understand it. And once that thought took hold, It was hard to push it away. It started without warning, the way most things did there. One moment the land ahead looked empty, just another stretch of hedge and uneven ground. And the next it felt as if the countryside had shifted its weight. Movement caught the eye first, not clear shapes, just something wrong. And how the distance behaved. We strained to make sense of it, every sense sharpened, heartbeat suddenly loud inside the chest. Training told us what it might be before certainty ever arrived. The first sight of German armor came in pieces. A dark edge where no shadow should be. A straight line cutting across the natural mess of fields. Then the shape settled into something unmistakable. It didn't rush toward us. It didn't need to. It appeared confident, almost patient, like it had time on its side. In that moment, the jokes I'd heard about our tank came back to me, not as words, but as a weight pressing down on the inside of my ribs. This was exactly the kind of meeting we had hoped to avoid. Everything inside the tank tightened. Movements became sharper, quicker, stripped of anything unnecessary. There was no room for big thoughts, only small decisions made fast. The space felt even smaller then, every breath warmer, every surface closer. Outside, the hedgerows that had hidden us now felt like walls, limiting choices instead of protecting them. I remember thinking how strange it was that fear didn't feel dramatic. It felt practical, focused, like another piece of equipment you were forced to carry. The first exchange came suddenly, violently enough to erase any remaining doubt. The ground seemed to react before the mind did. Sound and motion blended together, making it hard to tell what was happening where. You didn't have time to ask if you were doing well or badly. You only knew you were still there, still moving, still part of it. That was the moment when waiting ended and survival took over. And whatever confidence anyone had brought into those fields was either burned away or buried deep, where it couldn't interfere with what had to be done next. Once it began in earnest. There was no clear line between one moment and the next. Time didn't pass the way it used to. It compressed, folded in on itself, until everything existed in short bursts of action followed by brief, hollow pauses. The tank moved when it could, stopped when it had to, each decision shaped by what the ground allowed rather than what we wanted. The hedgerows that had felt suffocating before now became thin chances at survival, bits of cover measured in seconds rather than distance. I remember how hard it was to keep a sense of direction. The world beyond the periscope felt fractured, broken into pieces of smoke, dirt, and sudden movement. The German armor was closer than I expected. Too close for comfort, close enough that their presence felt physical, like pressure in the air. There was no time to admire anything about them. No room for comparison beyond the blunt awareness that they were solid and dangerous and very real. Each time we shifted position, it felt like exposing a nerve. The Sherman rattled and strained, responding faithfully but without reassurance. You trusted it because there was nothing else to trust, not because you believed it was enough. Inside, the heat rose quickly. Sweat mixed with grime, eyes stung, hands slipped and tightened again. Voices stayed short, stripped down to what mattered. No one raised their tone. There was no need. The tank itself carried the urgency, every vibration reminding us that a single mistake could close the space around us for good. I remember noticing small useless details in the middle of it all. The way dust hung in the air, the way smoke drifted unevenly across the field, as if the land was breathing out something it had held for too long. The fighting didn't feel like a clash of machines, so much as a contest of endurance. Who could stay exposed the longest? Who could move just a little sooner or a little later? Each exchange left something behind, a shape no longer moving, a fire starting where there had been solid ground moments before. It was hard to tell how long it lasted. Later, people would talk about minutes, but in my memory, it stretches and contracts, impossible to measure. All I knew then was that we were still there, still functioning, and that realization came with no sense of triumph. As it dragged on, a strange calm settled in. Not peace, but a narrowing of thought so complete that fear lost its edge. You didn't imagine outcomes anymore. You reacted. The body took over where the mind grew tired. Somewhere in that stretch of time, the idea of being mocked or underestimated stopped mattering entirely. There was no room for pride, wounded or otherwise. There was only the work in front of us and the silent understanding that when it ended, whatever shape the field took would stay with us far longer than the smoke ever could. By then, the fight had settled into something grim and deliberate. The rush of first contact was gone, replaced by a heavy awareness that this was not ending quickly. The ground around us was changing shape, not all at once, but piece by piece. Tracks tore up the fields, shell holes broke the neatness of the land, and fires burned where nothing had burned before. Each movement we made felt slower now, not because the tank couldn't move, but because every choice carried weight. You hesitated just long enough to imagine what might happen if you were wrong, then moved anyway. There was a moment when I understood how thin the line was between being alive and being finished. Not in an abstract way, but plainly, almost calmly. We shifted position along a narrow stretch of road, and for a few seconds, the tank was exposed in a way I will never forget. It felt like standing in an open doorway while someone decided whether to pull a trigger. Nothing dramatic happened in that instant, but the absence of it left a mark. I realized how much of survival depended on timing that no one controlled, and luck that never announced itself. The German tanks did not feel reckless. They felt methodical, persistent, as if they expected time to work in their favor. That knowledge pressed on us. We were smaller, lighter, easier to dismiss, and we knew it. But there was also a strange kind of resolve that came from that imbalance. You stopped expecting fairness. You stopped hoping the situation would improve. You focused instead on doing one thing correctly at a time, trusting that enough correct moments strung together might be sufficient. Inside the tank, fatigue began to creep in, not the kind that makes you slow, but the kind that makes you numb. Muscles ached from holding tension too long. The air felt stale, thick with heat and smoke, and every breath reminded you of how little space you truly had. Still, no one asked to stop. Stopping was not a real option. The work continued because it had to, because the alternative was unthinkable and strangely distant. I remember thinking, briefly, about how this would look afterward. How someone might stand in that same field and see nothing but grass growing back, the scars softened by time. That thought didn't bring comfort. It made everything feel temporary and heavy at once. Whatever happened next, I knew it would not stay confined to those minutes or that patch of ground. It was already settling somewhere deeper, becoming something that would return years later, uninvited. Long after the fields outside St. Lay had forgotten our names, the middle of it was the hardest to endure, when there was no sense of beginning or end, only continuation. By then, the field had become a place of smoke and broken shapes, and distance meant very little. Visibility came and went, opening briefly before closing again, forcing decisions to be made on fragments rather than certainty. You learned to accept incomplete information, to act without ever fully knowing what was happening beyond the narrow slice of world you could see. The heat inside the tank was constant now, pressing in from all sides. Sweat ran freely, carrying grime into the eyes, soaking clothes until they clung and rubbed raw. Hands moved automatically, performing tasks that had once required instruction, but now lived somewhere deeper, beyond conscious thought. Fatigue settled into the bones, but it was a fatigue that didn't slow you down. It stripped away anything unnecessary, leaving only what was required to keep going. Outside, the fighting had reached a point where the landscape barely resembled what it had been. Fires burned steadily, not flaring wildly, but holding on, feeding on what they could. The air shimmered, warped by heat and smoke, and sound lost its usual shape. becoming something distant and uneven. It was difficult to tell where one exchange ended and another began. Everything blended together, a continuous strain on the senses that left no room for relief. There was a moment when I became aware of how little I felt. Fear was still there, but muted, pushed aside by concentration. The thought of being hit no longer carried panic with it, only acknowledgement. If it happened, it happened. That realization did not feel brave. It felt empty. It was the mind's way of conserving strength, of refusing to spend energy on things it could not change. Somewhere in that stretch, the balance shifted. Not suddenly, not in a way that announced itself, but gradually, as one presence after another disappeared from view. Each absence registered slowly, as if the mind resisted understanding it all at once. The pressure eased, just slightly, enough to be noticed but not enough to relax. We stayed alert, careful not to believe too much in that change. Experience had already taught us that hope, when raised too quickly, could be just as dangerous as fear. When it finally began to loosen its grip, the change was subtle enough that it almost went unnoticed. The tension didn't vanish, it thinned. The kind of thinning you only recognize after the fact, when your shoulders drop a fraction and you realize how tightly they had been held. Smoke still hung over the field, drifting slowly now instead of churning. Shapes that had demanded attention moments earlier were gone, leaving behind spaces that felt unnaturally quiet. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It carried weight. Every second without movement felt provisional, as if the land itself were deciding whether it was finished with us. We stayed where we were, watching, listening, waiting for something to prove that the fight was truly over. The tank idled beneath us, warm and scarred, a shelter that suddenly felt fragile again now that the urgency had faded. Without constant action to occupy the mind, sensation returned all at once. The ache in the neck, the stiffness in the hands, the dull pounding behind the eyes. Outside the field told its own story. Vehicles stood at angles that made no sense, metal twisted and blackened, fire reduced to low, stubborn flames that refused to go out quickly. The smell lingered, thick and sour, settling into everything. It was the kind of smell that followed you even after you left, clinging to clothes, to skin, to memory. I remember looking at what was left and feeling no satisfaction, no surge of relief, only a growing heaviness, as if the ground had begun to pull at me. What surprised me most was how delayed everything felt. The danger had been immediate, but the understanding of it arrived slowly. Only then did the thought surface that this could have ended differently, that a small change in timing or position might have placed us among the wreckage instead of beside it. That awareness brought no drama with it, just a quiet sinking recognition of how narrowly things had turned. We remained cautious long after there was no clear reason to be. No one wanted to be the first to assume it was finished. Experience had taught us that the aftermath could still reach out and take something from you, so we waited, surrounded by the remains of those minutes that would later be counted and named, though they never felt contained to me. They spread outward into the rest of the day, into the nights that followed, and into the years when the field outside St. Lo would return uninvited, complete and silent. Whenever the world around me grew too still, after a while, we were told to hold where we were. The order felt strange in its simplicity, as if staying still could undo what had just happened. The tank no longer moved with purpose but with caution, small adjustments instead of forward momentum. The field had become something to endure rather than cross. Every patch of ground looked unsettled, as though it might still respond if disturbed. We watched the hedgerows again, not with urgency this time, but with suspicion, unwilling to trust the quiet that had settled over them. That was when the weight of it truly began to set in. During the fighting, there had been no room to consider consequences. Now they arrived one by one. I found myself staring at the same spots repeatedly, unable to look away, trying to reconcile. what I remembered seeing with what remained. The mind reached for order, for explanations, but found none that offered comfort. It was easier to focus on routine, on checking equipment, on staying ready for something else to go wrong. Guilt crept in quietly, not sharp or overwhelming, but persistent. It came without clear direction, attaching itself to moments that had seemed ordinary at the time. Decisions made quickly, actions taken without reflection. I didn't question whether they had been necessary. I questioned only whether they would follow me. That thought was harder to push aside than fear had been. Fear belonged to the moment. Guilt felt like it might last. The men around me moved differently now, slower, heavier. No one spoke unless there was a reason. Faces were drawn, eyes tired, in a way that sleep would not fix. We avoided looking too long at the wreckage, not out of disgust, but out of a kind of respect mixed with self-preservation. Staring too deeply made it easier to imagine ourselves in its place, and that was not something any of us needed to carry more vividly than we already did. As the hours passed, the sky remained unchanged, a dull gray that gave no sense of time. It felt as though the day refused to move on, trapping us in its aftermath. I remember thinking that this was how the fight would truly stay with me, not as noise or motion, but as stillness. As standing in a damaged field, waiting for the next order, knowing that even if nothing else happened there, something important had already been taken, and it would not be returned simply because the guns had fallen silent. By the time night began to press in, the sense of threat had not disappeared, only shifted. Darkness did not bring rest. It sharpened uncertainty. We stayed alert, eyes straining into spaces that daylight had at least outlined for us. The field looked different then, its damage softened by shadow, its dangers harder to judge. Every sound felt closer, even when there was nothing to trace it to. The mind, no longer consumed by action, began to wander in ways that were difficult to control. We held our position with a kind of weary discipline. Movements were careful, almost reluctant, as if stirring the ground too much might invite trouble back. I remember thinking how fragile the balance felt, how easily it could be broken by something unseen. The tank, still warm beneath us, felt less like protection and more like a reminder of what had drawn attention to us in the first place. Safety felt conditional, something borrowed rather than earned. Thoughts returned that I had managed to keep away during the fighting. Faces surfaced. In memory, not all of them familiar, some only glimpsed briefly, others imagined. I wondered what the same night looked like from the other side of the field, and whether anyone there was doing the same kind of remembering. The idea didn't bring sympathy or hatred. It brought a dull sense of connection that made everything heavier. The fight was over, but its reach was not. Sleep came in fragments, if it came at all. When I closed my eyes, the field reassembled itself, not as it had been before, but as it was now, altered and marked. I felt myself measuring time. Again, counting minutes not for survival but for endurance. It was then that I understood how these moments outlast the battle itself. They settle in quietly, waiting for later years when there will be nothing loud enough to drown them out. Even as orders eventually shifted and the night wore on, the sense of being tied to that place remained. Saintly was still ahead of us, still unresolved, but the ground we occupied had already claimed something permanent. I did not know then how often I would return to it in memory, how easily it would surface without warning. All I knew was that leaving the field would not mean leaving what it had given me, and that knowledge stayed with me long after the sky lightened and the world asked us to move again. Years passed before I understood what those minutes outside St. Lay had truly done to me. At the time, they were just another stretch of ground, another day survived. Life moved on the way it insists on doing. Uniforms were folded away, routines replaced, faces around me changed. From the outside, it must have looked as though the war had loosened its hold. But some places do not release you simply because you have left them. I carried that field with me into ordinary days. It surfaced without ceremony, in quiet moments when the world slowed enough to let memory speak. There was no pattern to it. A certain kind of stillness, a smell carried on the air, the way smoke hangs low before it clears. Suddenly, I was there. Again, not in fear, not in action, but in awareness. A clear understanding of how close everything had come to ending, and how little that fact had mattered to the land once we were gone. What troubled me most was not what we had done, but how easily it fit into the day it belonged to. The world did not pause for those burned vehicles or the men inside them. Crops would grow again. Roads would be repaired. Children would pass through places where we had measured life in seconds. Knowing that did not bring comfort. It reminded me how small we were, how quickly even the heaviest moments are absorbed and smoothed over by time. I never spoke much about it. Not because I couldn't remember, but because the memories were complete on their own. They did not need explanation or emphasis. They carried their weight quietly, the way they had from the beginning. When people asked, I offered little. Survival does not always come with stories worth telling aloud. Now, at the end of things, I see that those 18 minutes never truly ended. They simply changed shape. They followed me through the years, not loudly, not constantly, but faithfully. And when I think of the war, it is not the noise or the movement that returns first. It is the field outside Saint-Lô, still and altered, holding its silence, long after the fires burned out, and long after the men who passed through it learned how much of themselves they had left behind.